Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig into the broader cultural phenomenon of espionage storytelling. Unless you're living under a rock, you're aware that Christopher Nolan's new epic film, The Odyssey, has just released in theaters. It is positioned to be one of the major cultural events of this year. We get fewer and fewer epic movie moments as the years go on, and The Odyssey is really the big tentpole release of the summer that everybody's been talking about, and it has met with as close to universal acclaim as a blockbuster film of this scale can get. I have not yet seen it, but I will be seeing it very soon, and I'm excited to savor it. But it's gotten me thinking a lot about Christopher Nolan's relationship to the James Bond film series. Christopher Nolan is an avid Bond fan. He is a connoisseur of Bond, and he has made no secret of his desire to really have the opportunity to reinvent James Bond. He doesn't just want to do a single James Bond movie. He really wants to be able to reboot the series properly. And he's been in touch with the creatives behind the Bond franchise before, back when EON Productions, led by Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, were still managing the series. They met with Christopher Nolan, or at least that has been reported as such, and there were talks going on at different points about whether or not Christopher Nolan would take on the next Bond movie. The most significant set of talks, as far as we can tell, was after No Time to Die. Daniel Craig's James Bond had met his demise at the end of No Time to Die, leading into what presumably would be another full-scale reboot for the James Bond series. So it seemed like prime opportunity for Christopher Nolan to set in, and a lot of rumors and reports began springing up that Christopher Nolan was in fact talking to EON Productions. I myself have heard different things along the way. It seems from a variety of sources that EON Productions, after No Time to Die, knew that they needed to have some sort of succession plan. Michael G. Wilson was getting older. Barbara Broccoli was feeling like she wanted to explore other things, and so there was desire to either find a new caretaker that could take on Bond or a new partner. And my understanding from what I've heard is that Christopher Nolan and Syncope, his production company, was approached to be kind of that partner with EON Productions, that actually Christopher Nolan wouldn't just direct a one-off Bond movie, but might actually become an active, ongoing producer in the continuing future of the James Bond series. Those talks, as far as I understand it, got very complicated and didn't really move anywhere, but they did try to focus on getting a film or two off the ground. Most of the rumors are pretty consistent in saying that Christopher Nolan was being attached to direct two distinct Bond movies, a kind of double-header. The straw that broke the camel's back was both financial and in terms of creative control. Christopher Nolan is an absolutist. He's the most powerful filmmaker in the world, and he wanted as much control as he could possibly have if he was going to take on the, honestly, burden of reinventing James Bond. That is not just an assignment that he wanted, but it's also a high-pressure assignment. It's a high-pressure assignment that Denis Villeneuve and Stephen Knight and Amy Pascal and David Heyman are all feeling the heat of right now. It is a really big creative challenge, and Christopher Nolan wanted to do it on his terms or not at all, and he's insanely powerful as far as a director goes. He turned Oppenheimer into a mega smash hit. Nobody really saw that a film chronicling the life of Robert Oppenheimer could be a blockbuster, but when Christopher Nolan's name is attached, anything can happen. But here we are. He has moved on, and we have now The Odyssey, his great personal passion project epic. He said that after the critical success of Oppenheimer, he really saw this as his opportunity to seize on this moment where he could really get any film that he wanted to made, and he chose to make The Odyssey. So it's a deeply personal film for him, and I'm glad it exists. I think Christopher Nolan has become a significantly more interesting and compelling filmmaker with time. The ideas he's exploring were right there from the start, from his early movies, but his continual exploration of film grammar and the way he is always encouraging himself to go and play with new textures, new storytelling structures is honestly inspiring. But as much as I'm excited that the Odyssey is here, and I can't wait to see it myself, the question lingers, did we miss out on a Christopher Nolan Bond movie? We have some idea as to what a Christopher Nolan Bond movie would feel like. Bond was baked into his Batman films as a light influence. He reconsidered Batman and his relationship to gadgets as being akin to Bond and Q. Lucius Fox in the Batman movies that Christopher Nolan directed is kind of this Q figure, and you get brief nods to Bruce Wayne's playboy life in a sort of James Bond way. That influence is there. There are homages to certain Bond textures in Inception, and of course there is Tenet, which is Christopher Nolan's love letter to the broader spy genre. It's not just James Bond in there. There's homages to Fritz Lang's spy movies. There's homages to Mission Impossible in there, but there is a lot of Bond in there, from the gray three-piece suit that we expect and associate with Bond to textures pulled straight from Fleming, the villain and his relationship with his wife, and this extended set piece in the middle of the film on a boat is largely pulled from Fleming's short story, The Hildebrand Rarity, and Nolan is open about that influence. Nolan is a deep-cut Bond fan. He loves the Fleming literature. He said Timothy Dalton is his favorite Bond in many ways because Dalton is closest to the books, and that's where undoubtedly Christopher Nolan's vision for a rebooted Bond might have gone. We got rumblings that Nolan really wanted to do a period piece, which is not surprising. Nolan has done period pieces before, most recently in Oppenheimer, and he has done them very well. It's very easy to imagine his very grounded take on the mid-20th century, whether it was the 1950s or the 1960s, rooting this version of Bond back in that context. But maybe Christopher Nolan still wanted to approach the present day. Either way, his conception of the character would be undoubtedly grounded in that sort of dark, slightly introspective, reserved interpretation of Bond. That is generally how Christopher Nolan directs lead actors. He is drawn to slightly internalized, a little bit enigmatic men. He does this sort of portrayal over and over and over again of these sometimes stoic, but sometimes tortured protagonists that are a little bit aloof. And I think his version of Bond would have been an interesting one to see because it would have been probably more in line with Dalton's Bond. It would have been very interesting to see how audiences would have responded to that kind of interpretation when a director like Christopher Nolan is doing it. Timothy Dalton's Bond has had a renaissance now. Timothy Dalton's Bond is my favorite Bond, so I'm glad to see that he's so celebrated. But there was a narrative for a while that Timothy Dalton's Bond was kind of hard for audiences to attach to. He certainly wasn't the movie star Bond that Pierce Brosnan was. The Daniel Craig era already pulled a lot from the Christopher Nolan playbook. Casino Royale was well in development before Batman Begins came out, but Batman Begins comes out and Casino Royale comes out soon thereafter. So this momentum of origin stories about these reinvented versions of characters unfolded in parallel. So there was already a sense that the Craig era and Nolan's Batman were on the same track. And then the Craig era starts borrowing certain tropes and ideas from The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises. You get some of those feelings in these movies, and there's a lot of crossover in terms of collaborators. Hans Zimmer coming in on the Craig movies, the cinematographers that Christopher Nolan likes to work with, Christopher Nolan's editor partner participating in Spectre. There is this feeling that there is a little bit of shared language between them. And I really wonder how audiences would have connected to his distinct version of Bond as an isolated character, as opposed to just the cumulative experience of the movie, because I think Christopher Nolan's protagonists are people who tend to work within the fabric of the film he's created, but they don't necessarily stand out as sort of like movie star characters in the way that we think of James Bond. That as much as people really enjoy Christian Bale's interpretation of Bruce Wayne and Batman, there's a sense that he's really kind of firmly integrated into those Christopher Nolan movies. He's not this sort of larger-than-life cultural vessel. He is not Batman, the icon. He's this sort of deconstructed version of that character. And part of me wonders whether Nolan's Bond would really have been the cultural icon that people are expecting him to be and are hoping that we'll get when Bond is recast for the upcoming Bond 26. I think my biggest reservation about Christopher Nolan tackling Bond is that Christopher Nolan has never had a really strong sense of warm sensuality in his movies. Christopher Nolan doesn't seem to have a strong hedonistic impulse in his work. And one of the things that I think is intrinsic in the Bond fantasy is that there is this element that Bond is a character you can kind of live vicariously through. You are able to experience the world with him. The character was designed specifically that way by Ian Fleming, that he could be this sort of loosely defined construct that people could kind of project onto and experience adventures through. He was less of a fully defined human being in all respects than he was this sort of literary device. And the film movies fleshed that character out as a screen presence, but there is still this sense that the experience of the movies are doing the work of kind of pulling you along in experiencing the world that Bond inhabits. And I don't know that Christopher Nolan's approach to storytelling ever breaks away from the momentum of his story to just kind of smell the roses in the way that a Bond movie often does. And I hope that the next Bond movie continues to do as well. That I think one of the primary attributes of Bond storytelling is that they're not just momentum focused. They're not necessarily always focused on their like story and thematic dimensions, but there's just a sense of texture. Bond films are about the vibes. And I don't know that Christopher Nolan is enough of a hedonist to really savor the Bond vibes. I think he would have done some really interesting things conceptualizing who Bond was and Bond's world and how we would think of even concepts like the Bond villain. It's very possible Christopher Nolan might have told a Bond story chronologically out of sequence. He does that a lot. He didn't really do a lot of timey shenanigans with the Batman stories, but it's not hard to imagine a pre-title sequence that was in fact a flash forward to something that was going to come later in the movie, and you're kind of playing around with those spaces. And so as I ramble here, where I fall on the question of Christopher Nolan doing a Bond movie is that it's a movie I really wanted to see because I think Christopher Nolan is such a capable filmmaker that whatever it produced would have been fascinating as a film object. But I don't think what Christopher Nolan would have given us is necessarily something akin to the platonic idea of a James Bond movie as it had been culturally developed up to that time. And I'm not even sure it really would have been a fully bodied rendering of Fleming with all of his peculiar foibles and sort of primal hedonistic impulses that are powering his writing. It would have been a really interesting conceptual experiment to have Christopher Nolan apply his full vision to James Bond. In some ways, I'm very glad that Bond is being rebooted in a way that is less focused on any one singular directorial vision and is again about creating a template for Bond to kind of continue to grow. We'll see how well the new producers, writer and director do with that assignment. But Denis Villeneuve has been brought in to shepherd this initial assignment, but it looks like he's working with a creative team of collaborators. He does not have final cut. Stephen Knight has been working on the script. Stephen Knight has a strong authorial voice of his own. It's not just Denis Villeneuve's Bond 26, but it is a truly collaborative expression. Christopher Nolan's version of Bond would have very much been uniquely Christopher Nolan's version of Bond. It's one that I wish we had seen, but it's also, for the sake of the series, I'm glad it was not the route the series took. Let me know how you feel about that in the comments. Was this a grave missed opportunity? Do you still regret the fact that Christopher Nolan didn't take Bond, or are you comfortable with the direction things are going? As always, I'll catch you in the next one.